So today's schedule is going to be the first talk will be by Mr. Sateesh Venkatesh. Uh, the topic is about exploring differences between elephant communities in Asia and how we interact with them, followed by a conversation on elephant travels uh, by Mathew George in conversation with Sateesh Venkatesh, and then followed by question and answer sessions, which will be moderated by Anikethan Hathwar. So, before starting the event, a brief introduction about myself. I'm Rahul. I'm from Hosnagra, Karnataka, and I'm currently studying MSc in Wildlife Conservation Action at Bivir, Pune. I have completed my thesis on habitat assessment and understanding people's perception towards smooth-coated otters in Ganapati Lake, Sagra town of Karnataka. I have participated in various bird census and surveys, volunteered for Nature Conservation Foundation's Project Leopard, and have also worked with Mysore Zoo as a volunteer educator. I have recently joined ANCF as an intern and got this opportunity to introduce the event. So, moving forward, our first talk will be by Mr. Sateesh Venkatesh, exploring differences between elephant communities in Asia and how we interact with them. Regarding Sateesh Venkatesh, he is an animal behavior and conservation specialist, and he has spent years traveling the world across Africa, Asia, and South America to study the behavior and intelligence of everything from elephants raiding farm fields and jaguars poaching baby turtles to domesticated dogs and cats being trained to push buttons to get treats. He does his research from the inside by living among the animals, communicating with them, and even negotiating with them. His goal is to understand why they behave the way they do and devise strategies to more peacefully share the planet as humans increasingly encroach on their habitats. I welcome you and I request you to take it forward, sir.
Excellent, thank you. As he said, my name is Sateesh Venkatesh. I'll just share my screen. Give me 1 second here. Okay, so my talk today is a short, brief overview of my work with elephants, and particularly in 3 different countries in Asia. I'm going to talk a little bit about my work in Thailand, India, and then also in Myanmar. Each group of elephants that I worked with has a slightly different condition that they live in, slightly different status in terms of if they're wild or if they're captive, and then also a different group of people who work with them. So for instance, one group works captive mahouts, some are rangers that work in the wild, all of these different kind of environments. And then also each country in itself has its own issues for dealing with and working with elephants. This is mostly an informal discussion where I just want to kind of talk about some of the work I've done and some of the insights it's given me into how we work with elephants in different countries around the world, and then also the challenges that each country and each specific region has. So each country and each specific region have a specific issue that they're dealing with, or a challenge with elephants in that region. So I'll talk a little bit about each, and mostly it's a discussion of my personal experience in each location and kind of how each experience in each country has led to kind of my research questions and goals in the future. All right, so I'm going to start off here with my work in Thailand. So just a little brief overview of elephants in Thailand. There's about 1,000 elephants in the wild in Thailand and about 3,000 elephants in captivity. So a majority of the elephants are in captivity. In addition to that, there used to be a much larger elephant population in captivity, but as working conditions changed and the need for elephants reduced, this captive population has greatly decreased. One of the other considerations when we were talking about elephants in the wild and elephants in captivity in Thailand is that elephants in the wild are restricted to only small regions, so only small protected parks that contain the small population of 1,000 elephants or so. The captive elephants are mostly in the tourism industry, and they range throughout the country, but a large population of them are in the north, and then also another large population is in the south. But throughout the country, there is a range in tourism activities, which I'll talk a little bit more about. So kind of the history of elephants working in Thailand. Elephants in Thailand have had a long history. It kind of started off with people using elephants just to move things around as kind of animals for labor. And then also it started off with using elephants in war. So you can see up in the top right-hand corner here, some kind of graphical depictions of how that might have looked. In the distant past, there's a large population of elephants in the wild, and then people would capture them and use them for events like war. As things progressed, there was a shift from using elephants in war to using elephants in logging. So logging in Thailand was quite big until about the 1970s, where there was an outright ban on logging throughout the country. This caused a huge amount of elephants to basically become unemployed. And because elephants are so difficult to take care of and so expensive to take care of, they needed to form some sort of occupational job. And as a result of that, there was this move towards tourism. So this move towards tourism was a gradual shift, but it also varied in how basically people interact with elephants. People were coming in much more closer contact with elephants. And as a result as well, they desired elephants to do different things. So when elephants were logging, they were mostly in the forest, mostly pulling logs, and didn't really interact with too many people other than their mahouts or people that work closely with them. When elephants are moving into tourism, basically the establishment of tourism in Thailand originally was mainly a show of kind of elephants logging. So it was kind of logging shows, basically skills that they had been trained to do. As this idea of tourism kind of took off and it became more profitable, basically the more tricks or interesting things that an elephant could show and do, that would draw more people, and that would also then draw more money. So we had this progression to slowly more and more kind of controlled training and shows of elephants. So one of the big things is elephant riding, but then also elephant circuses where they're standing on balls or playing instruments or painting pictures. And we see this progression towards kind of this more kind of clownish behavior, I would say. And also, as we progress in this kind of controlled movement of elephant tourism, we also see this change where elephants are then becoming more and more in cities and in locations where it's easy to access them, where tourists can easily see them. And all of these areas are more unnatural. And also, for instance, with elephant riding, the more individuals or people you can get to ride, the more money you can make. So we see this kind of increase in work or need for elephants to do work throughout the day and in city environments. So we have this kind of change gradually progressing. In more recent years, probably in the last like probably 10 years or so, gradually, but more so in the last, say in the last 10 years or so, we've seen the shift where tourism is basically desired to see elephants in more natural conditions and in more wild environments. And then also there's been a reduction of kind of this elephant riding and elephant circuses in general. So those venues are basically making less money than they used to make. There still is a few that make quite a bit of money. So those are still sustained by people that are interested in them. But overall, as an industry, it seems like there's been a general shift to kind of this more ecotourism model and more of an ethical model where basically as a tourism industry, people are desiring to see elephants treated better and also in more ethical conditions as well. So when we're talking about ethical elephant tourism, what does that mean? It's a really difficult thing to define. Basically, what we know in general is we're trying to create the most viable natural environment for elephants and also the best conditions for them to live under. And when we're talking about that, that usually means shifting from kind of this city environment, maybe a kind of constrained environment where there's not much access to natural forage, to a natural wilder environment. So we see the shift where we're trying to have elephants in kind of a more natural environment. And also, when we're talking about ethical elephant tourism, I think a big component of that is actually how much contact you have with elephants. Elephants can tend to be very dangerous. Being close to elephants can be very dangerous, and also elephants can be very unpredictable. So one of the main things about ethical elephant tourism and basically the idea of working with elephants is you have to understand that, and you have to make sure that tourists understand that as well. And that you need the shift to basically having less contact. So the less contact that you have with elephants in the more wild environments that you have for the elephants, typically the more ethical those tourism activities will be. So that's kind of this progression of ethical elephant tourism, ecotourism, and kind of elephants in general, kind of as a short history of elephants in Thailand. I'm going to shift to one specific project that I worked on. So this project that I worked on probably about 12 to 15 years ago. This is a tribal village in northern Thailand, about 5 hours from Chiang Mai. It's called Hoi Paku. It's a traditional elephant keeping village. They've worked with elephants for probably about 500 years or so. As a village itself, they have a population of probably about 60 to 70 elephants that are captive. In the past, they might have had more elephants, a little bit less elephants. It's kind of ranged a little bit, but I think it's mostly been working its way up until that number. These elephants that are in captivity, they've shifted what they've used them for in the past. So quite a while ago, when there weren't really roads going to this area, elephants were obviously used more for transportation. And then in addition, when elephants were logging in Thailand, there was the shift to elephants working outside, logging in different areas. After the logging ban, a lot of these elephants were out of work, and there was the shift with almost all of the elephants into this captive tourism industry. This meant that while logging might have happened kind of in more rural regions, possibly closer to the village, the shift to tourism meant that a lot of these elephants then moved from the village into the cities, and people had to go along with them. So as I said, they have about 60 to 70 elephants. They've got this long tradition of working with elephants. And a majority of the men in the village at one point do become mahouts and take care of elephants. So as you can see here in a couple of these pictures, we've got some older people kind of taking care of some of the baby elephants. And then also you can see the elephants are quite integrated into the village. They come through the village at various times during the year when they have rests from camps in the city. And then also they have kind of a forested area, which they keep. All right. So one of the big keys with working with elephants, and I think one of the main keys, especially when we're talking about ethical elephant tourism, is having good mahouts and this traditional knowledge that's kind of passed down, and this understanding and passion for working with elephants. And I think that's shifted over the years. This village in particular has this long history of working with elephants, and then also this long generational history of sons taking over and learning to work with elephants when they're quite young, and then also spending a long time with elephants. So we've got individuals that grew up next to elephants. One of my favorite individuals, which I'll talk a little bit about in a second, is Patty Sai and his elephant Tong Di. They've been together for about 55 years. So Patty Sai is about 55 years old, or at least when I took this picture, which you'll see in a second. His elephant is about 50 years old, and he grew up with this elephant, and they have a strong bond and knowledge of how they work together. And that's really essential when working with elephants. You see this kind of shift in more recent years in some different regions where mahouts kind of move in and out with different elephants at different times, and they don't really have the strong understanding of their specific elephant and how their elephant reacts. And I think that changes with this long-term passed down knowledge, and also this long-term relationship with elephants. Basically, the longer you work with elephants and the better you know your elephant, the more you can anticipate any changes or problems with your elephant. And therefore, these mahouts kind of don't need to have this kind of aggressive nature that you see in some other areas, or with individuals that have a less developed relationship with their elephants. So we see this kind of long-term traditional passed down knowledge of working with mahouts in different areas. This traditional mahout keeping, it's been in this village for a long time, but we see this gradual decrease of it over time, where younger individuals, though there are quite a few different individuals that are interested in taking on being mahout, it's become a less appealing job. It's typically a lower paid job, and it's also typically in potentially not great conditions in the city. In addition to that, it doesn't necessarily allow for kind of advancement or movement as some of other industries are. So we've seen this younger generation where there seems to be less individuals taking up this moving career. So what's the kind of change in this ecotourism model? So one thing in particular with this village is because they've got this long history of working with elephants and this kind of strong knowledge and relationship with elephants, they've got a healthy respect for what the elephants need. In addition to that, they want to maintain their kind of traditional lifestyle and kind of develop their village as a whole. So when we came to work in this village quite a while ago, they wanted to start this project where they wanted to take elephants that have been working in the city in kind of tourism camps in the city, and they wanted to bring them back into the village. So the idea behind this model was, instead of having elephants in the city and tourism camps, they'd bring elephants back to the forested area near the village, which they do maintain a large forested area. The village itself has a traditional forestry method where they have crop rotations and such. Over time as well, they keep a conservation forest, which is basically a section of the forest which they don't really hunt in and they don't harvest for fields or for timber either. So they've got this very well-preserved forested area, which they can maintain elephants in. Typically, this forested area is just traditionally kept, but it's also used when elephants do return to the village in order to give them a rest period in a natural environment. So what the village wanted to do was they wanted to create this ecotourism base at the village, which would both provide a healthy, welfare-friendly environment for the elephants to live in, and then also provide the community with income. One, from this kind of tourism base where people come to see elephants, but then also kind of generating economy and money for the rest of the community as well. So they started homestays, crafts, they started selling local crafts, teaching traditional methods of bamboo weaving and such, and then also kind of just in general passing on traditional knowledge. One of the big things that we saw as well, that as this project developed and changed, is that we saw the shift from some of the younger people, which they wanted to leave the village because there wasn't many opportunities in the village. This is then creating some kind of opportunities in the village and kind of this diversity where they're seeing foreigners come in, they're interacting with foreigners, and kind of progressing the village a little bit further, which made the village environment or living in that village environment much more appealing. In addition as well, this ecotourism model has the benefit of also bringing back mahouts to the village. So when the elephants come back, they obviously need individuals to come back with them to take care of the elephants. And because of that, we saw this shift where we have this kind of, at least for the adults, sending off their young sons to the city to work with elephants often was very stressful because they don't know what conditions they're living in. Also, there can be social problems in the cities as well. So having those younger mahouts come back to the village as well to take care of the elephants, and then as well living at home, kind of has this social aspect of it as well. So in general, when we're talking about the future of elephants in Thailand, what are we talking about? So as I said, there's a large population of captive elephants in Thailand, but there's very little space for them in the wild. So we do see this kind of conundrum where we've got this desire to work with elephants and this huge industry based around elephants in Thailand, but there's not any wild space to keep these elephants. So one of the issues, especially when a lot of people are like, oh, we should just release them all into the wild, is that there's really just not enough space in the wild. So we do have, even though we've got a small population of wild elephants, we do see this, there still is heavy human-elephant conflict with wild elephants, where elephants are coming into people's fields and having a good amount of conflict with people as well. So releasing all of these captive elephants in the wild without regard for how we do that doesn't make sense. But one possible future for elephants in Thailand could be the shift to kind of this more ecotourism ethical model of elephant tourism, where we create reserves or forested areas which would need to be developed from scratch because in a lot of areas those don't exist. But over time, if you're able to integrate those areas and wild areas close to reserves or also in different locations around the country, kind of expanding this forested area, which the country as a whole is doing, then you could have viable locations to potentially reintroduce elephants or semi-reintroduce elephants, where you kind of have elephants living in a wild environment that are somewhat captive or somewhat managed in order to reduce the human-elephant conflict. So potentially they would still have mahouts, but they would travel around and live in a wild environment. And then potentially this could shift to being more and more wild over time, depending on the level of conflict or the amount of space available. But you could have this kind of fluctuation that you would have. So that's kind of my overview of this project that I worked in Thailand. Gonna move on to India. So I've worked a little bit in India, mostly in southern India. And with India, we have kind of a unique case where we've got the largest population of Asian elephants in the world. So we've got about, I think about 25,000 or so Asian elephants in the wild in India. There's a much lower population of captive elephants in India, but specifically with India, I want to talk a little bit more about the wild population. So with the wild elephants in India, we've got this huge wild population. And so this wild population in India, we've got a large wild population, and because of that, we've got a huge amount of conflict. And this conflict is caused by having fragmented forested areas where we've got elephants moving in and out of different forested regions. And then also these elephants coming into conflict with people due to food and then also due to movement in different spaces. So elephants in general have, especially Asian elephants, have this fission-fusion model of how they move and interact. So we see these groups of elephants where they kind of form smaller subgroups. These subgroups interact with each other and then diverge and move around. So depending on different times of year, you might have more movement and shifting in elephant populations. Because of this movement and shifting, you might also see that these groups of elephants come more and more in conflict with people as their habitat size reduces or as people encroach upon their wild areas. So food preference as well. So one of the big conflicts that we see with elephants, especially in India, but then in all of the different regions that we have in Asia and Africa, is that we have crop raiding. So we've got elephants that are coming into people's fields. They're eating large portions of crops, sometimes potentially an entire field in a night. That field is that whole season's worth of planting. And as a result, we've got this high level of conflict where people are trying to maintain their livelihoods, but they're coming into conflict with elephants eating or constantly causing this general threat of predation of their crops. As a result, we've kind of got this high level of conflict and tension with elephants. One of the things we have to remember when we're talking about crop raiding and elephants coming into fields and eating food is that it's not a conscious or villainous event. And I think a lot of the time when we talk about elephants eating food in people's fields, that it turns them into kind of villains, which in people's minds, I'm sure that's the way it actually genuinely is. But in terms of elephants, it's a kind of evolutionary adaptation where elephants feed in general, moving in different locations. They're basically, elephants only can process about 40% of the food that they eat. So they constantly need to eat. As a result, as they keep moving and keep eating in different areas, they need to kind of constantly eat a diversity of different foods. And they're always looking for the most nutritional food that they can get for the least amount of effort. When we're talking about crops, these are foods that are made specifically for us to be palatable. Therefore, as well, they're highly palatable as well to elephants and usually highly nutritious. So when we're talking about elephants going into people's fields, especially when they do have kind of this larger forested area that they might live in, and it also might have high quality food in it as well. And we often wonder, why are elephants leaving this forested area in order to come into this person's field and eat all their food? And you have to remember that this crop area could be a very highly concentrated, dense area of very highly palatable food. So evolutionarily, it would make sense that elephants would seek out and prioritize going into these high priority food areas in order to eat this food. So we're talking about wild elephants as well. there's a lot of different mitigation methods, and I'm not going to get too much into all of them now. That can be its own whole different separate talk. But basically, overall, we found that because of the amount of the high intelligence of elephants and the diversity of abilities and problem solving that elephants have, that often mitigation methods that we developed are often very difficult to maintain in the long run. So we see that some things like this electric fence here, or ditches often, there can be many different types of mitigation methods. There's chili fences, bee fences in different regions. And we see all these mitigation methods that are effective in some cases, but not in other cases, or in one region and not in another region, or only effective for a short amount of time, because elephants will find some way past them eventually. Or that maintaining them is too costly and ineffective for populations or regions in which they're found in. So this kind of development and change and development and kind of progression of mitigation methods has been very challenging over time. And as we've developed more and more different mitigation methods, they tend to be more complicated or diverse, and the elephants have constantly found some way to get past them eventually. And this is the general challenge when we're talking about elephants and humans living next to each other. And some of the things that my research works on, and some of the questions that we ask about and that we can talk about later maybe, is that how can we diversify and change how we're dealing with elephants? When we're talking about mitigation methods, quite often we're creating barriers or deterrents for elephants. So some sort of negative reinforcement for elephants to go in there. Is there some way that we can create maybe positive reinforcements, potentially integrate more corridors or motivation for elephants to move around these human-centric areas? Is there other methods that we haven't necessarily thought of? Quite often we talk about, young bulls or older males or rambunctious individuals that are the primary components of crop breeding. And we see that is true in some regions, but it shifts in different other regions, and it shifts during different times of year. And so we do have this kind of confusion about who is actually instigating this crop breeding. Is it all elephants? Which doesn't seem to be true. There does seem to be certain individuals that crop breed more often, but that does seem to shift depending on the situation and the region. So one of the questions that I've talked about and that I've asked in my future research is that maybe we can shift to determine mitigation methods based on personality types, so potentially more exploratory individuals or more neophobic individuals. We can develop mitigation methods based on personality types. So that's mainly the talk that I was going to have for India. Now we're going to move on to Myanmar. So the first group that we talked about was this group in Thailand, which is a captive population for tourism mainly. The second group was mostly this group of elephants that I worked with in India, that's kind of in this more wild environment, or that is a wild population. And then lastly, I'm going to talk about Myanmar, which is kind of its own unique case, and they kind of have a semi-wild lifestyle, which we'll talk about. So kind of a little bit about the history of elephants in Myanmar. Elephants, similarly to India and Thailand, have kind of this long history of working with elephants in different ways. The difference between India and Thailand that we see in Myanmar is that there's still quite a bit of logging in Myanmar done. And elephants are still used for logging, primarily used for logging, and we still see a heavy component of elephant logging. So as a result, we do have this large captive population of elephants in Myanmar. Myanmar actually has the largest captive population with around 5,000 elephants, and about half of those elephants are state-owned and used for logging. So we see this large population of captive elephants primarily used for logging. There's a little bit of tourism, but due to just there not being as big a tourism industry in Myanmar for elephants as there's in Thailand. We see less tourism elephants in Myanmar. And one of the interesting things about Myanmar is, unlike Thailand, which had a huge reduction in the forested area at one point, Myanmar does actually still retain a large portion of forested area. It has probably one of the largest, one of the highest percentages of forested area when compared to the other countries that we see around the region, possibly about 85% forested area, which means that there is viable land for a lot of these elephants in captivity to live in. There is a wild environment, but again, we do see this kind of still conflict in different regions. And one of the variations that we have with Myanmar that's different from Thailand and India is that we do have kind of a different environment for national parks where they're not as readily visited or kind of interacting or have a huge amount of interaction as you do with the larger parks in India and potentially Thailand as well. So you don't have the same kind of tourism aspect or influence on the elephant population in Myanmar. So I already kind of talked about the current status there. So, as I said, elephants were typically used in Myanmar for logging. So we see this, this is still typically true. The group of elephants that I worked with in Myanmar was a group of logging elephants. I worked with them kind of in between seasons when they weren't logging to conduct behavioral experiments with these elephants. And one of the interesting parts about logging with elephants in Myanmar is, one, it's highly regulated. So as I said, there's a large portion of those captive elephants that are owned by the state. And additionally, the government kind of works with private organizations as well for logging. And when elephants, so basically elephants logging in Myanmar is a highly regulated process. So you see often where these elephants have strict data records. We've got very long-term records where we've got generational history on elephants, healthcare of elephants, and then also we've got kind of this integrated formal system of how you train elephants, what elephants are made to do, and then also how much stress those elephants on. And then typically as well, you have this kind of constant vet care with elephants because they're governmentally owned, they're supported as well. And because of this industry, there's some instances that people say that there are good healthcare treatments for these elephants, and they kind of have also a retirement age as well. Again, logging is a very stressful environment, so there are some health risks as well with logging. But in a regulated environment with good mahouts, that this could be a potentially safer environment than some of the strict kind of circus camps that we see in Thailand. One of the big differences that you have with logging elephants that you don't have with these captive elephants in the city is that logging elephants typically live in a wild environment. So with these elephants that I worked with, almost all of their diet was wildly foraged. So typically their normal activity is they go out during the day for logging activities, kind of early in the morning. They'll log in the forest. While they're logging, they'll typically forage in the forest. And then they come back to camp at night. When they come back to camp at night, the mahouts will actually release them into the forest, and the elephants will spend the night in the forest. Which is why, so this kind of duality where they spend their day working and kind of captive, and then this kind of wild environment at night, is why these elephants are kind of deemed as semi-wild. So we call them semi-wild because about half of their time is spent in the forest kind of independently on their own. So as I said, they'll work during the day and mahouts will release them into the forest or a wild environment at night. They'll typically roam wherever they want. In some regions, if it's available, elephants will interact with wild elephants and sometimes even breed with wild elephants. And then we also see this kind of general natural kind of lifestyle at night. So they do have wild movements. And also what I was interested particularly with my research is that these captive elephants as well also do cooperate. So we see this kind of wild behavior where elephants are going into people's fields at night and stealing food as well. So with these elephants, they kind of form, they're definitely captive elephants, but they do show a lot more potentially wild behaviors than we would see with traditionally captive elephants. And there may be a cross or kind of a transition species, I don't want to say species, but transition kind of behavioral type that we see between wild elephants and purely captive, maybe tourism elephants. So we have this kind of variation between the two that's quite interesting, where we have elephants that are fully capable of living in a wild environment and fending for themselves in a wild way, but they're also working closely with people in captivity. So one of the things with the semi-wild environment and kind of the development of things over time is that, at least when I was working there a few years ago, about 4 or 5 years ago now, there was a shift as well in Myanmar where there were talks about reducing the amount of logging. And if they were reducing that amount of logging, then there would be a large amount of elephants out of work. So similar situation that what happened in Thailand. And in order to provide for these kind of ex-logging elephants, there was the idea that maybe the future of these elephants could be more in a tourism sector, but in a tourism sector different than the typical process that we saw in Thailand. So because Myanmar does have this wild environment, there was discussions about maybe reintroducing these elephants into kind of a protected area that's kind of semi-managed, where elephants would still have mahouts potentially working with them or going out with them, but they would live in a completely wild environment, and it would create a tourism industry for people to come see them in this kind of wild location. So kind of a newer tourism industry that kind of crosses over both what we see in India with wild tourism with elephants, and then also what we see with captive elephants in Thailand, and kind of this general shift that we've had over the years in Thailand to kind of this more ecotourism ethical model. So Myanmar potentially could shift with this large population of captive elephants and this large wild area to kind of this ecotourism model that could bring in a potentially new sector of tourism and money for the country as well. Some of the challenge that we saw and setbacks that we saw with this is that governmental changes within the country has caused a lot of conflict. So we have conflict both with human-elephant conflict, where we do have to be careful if we're talking about releasing elephants in any context, that we're not causing more human-elephant conflict, and that these captive elephants that we're releasing are going to be causing more problem actually than the wild elephants that are in the region. And then also this governmental change has kind of shifted the focus away from this kind of ecotourism model, possibly back towards logging environments. And then also it's created a shift in tourism where there's been a reduction in tourism, both because of the pandemic, but then also because of political strife. So in general, future possibilities for working with elephants, just in general from these 3 countries, I think the shift to kind of working with elephants in a kind of controlled, more wild environment is something that's going to shift in different countries. And I think the development of more wild areas, more wild corridors can kind of relieve some of the conflict. And then finally, I think understanding a little bit more about individuals that are causing conflict and how individuals cause conflict and the motivations behind them can kind of help us relieve some of this conflict and issues for these different regions. I think also as well, region-specific or individual-specific mitigation or understanding is essential for dealing with any elephants. And then that's it. And stop sharing.
Uh, Thank you, sir. It was a really wonderful talk and different types of situations in different countries. This was a new perspective to us also.
Excellent.
So moving forward, we have a conversation lined up stated elephant travels, and this will be uh, taken over by Mathew George and Mr. Sateesh Venkatesh. Just a minute. Sorry. Uh, a brief introduction about Mathew, sir. Mathew George is a businessman who is passionate about elephants. He has been part of Friends of Elephant since its inception as volunteer of the first department NGO on varying activities connected with elephant over the last. He disseminates knowledge he gained on elephants over the years through his blog and encourages the public to support activities. Over to you, sir.
Thanks, Rahul, for that kind introduction. Satish, you took us through three different countries, Myanmar, Thailand, and India, and with your vast experience in interacting and understanding the captive and the wild elephants. I would like to start with Thailand, a country which was devastated with the COVID pandemic. I'm talking more in terms of the impact to the captive elephants there more than the wild. Um, as I understand, a large number of elephants from the central and the south had to move northwards to the traditional villages. And it was a journey of all sorts, a long distance journey. It was funded by organizations across the world. And then most of these elephants came back to natural environment and natural habitats with their family. These, as I understand, these elephants were leased out by these villages and to operators, and then who in turn lease them out to the tourism industry. That was also an opportunity, as I read, for most of these captive elephants to find a permanent place, because most of them didn't get back when the tourism came back post-pandemic. Thanks to the worldwide attention they got, they had a lot of funding, and then most of them, some of them, I don't know the numbers, some of them stayed back as close to the villages with the mouths, as you mentioned. And it was interesting to know from your presentation, the ratio in Thailand, as you mentioned, is 1,000 wild elephants to 3,000 captive elephants. In India, as you know, we have 2,000, it's a reverse, 2,500 captive elephants, and we have close to 27,000 wild elephants, it's 10 times higher. So the scenario will be different in these two countries when dealing with the captive elephants. In your personal view, you mentioned about ethical elephant tourism. Do you think that is a mirage which we are chasing? How much of this ethical tourism has been implemented at the grassroots level from what you've seen in Thailand, especially in these tourist camps? I would like to start with a small question to you.
Yeah, so I think there is a huge, oh, something's happened. There is a huge shift in this kind of ethical tourism. I think in general, it's caused by individuals kind of, or just the tourism industry in general, pushing for kind of more ethical methods for working with elephants. And I think it is somewhat of, I guess you were saying it's kind of if we're kind of trying to grasp at something that's not really possible. And I think in some ways that is true, where really what we're talking about is the best, most ethical way that we can work with elephants is basically with wild elephants and giving them wild environments to live in. I think the problem that we have in places like Thailand, as you mentioned, is that there's just not that wild environment to live in. And therefore, we need to find the best methods that we can provide for that time. I think there's always room for improvements and change. And I think like places like Myanmar, when we're talking about the shift from captive to a completely wild environment, is something that's one of the big differences.
It was also interesting to note this cradle to grave relationship between the mahout and the elephant in the villages, which makes a huge difference. I come from the southern state of Kerala. We have probably the second highest captive elephants in the country after Assam. There, the frequent issues are most of these mahouts, a good number of them are alcoholic. They indulge in a lot of cruelty, and we also see there's a high turn in terms of mahouts. They don't stay with an elephant more than 3 or 5 years, either because of better prospects from other elephant owners or due to their own doings. So in such situation, we see that the elephant is subjected to a lot of cruelty when the mahouts change, and that is a way they bring them in their custody with the new mahout, and it's a very cruel process, and which I think it's a great blessing for the elephants in the villages in Thailand that most of them stay with the mahouts through and through, irrespective of what they do. So less cruelty, and I tend to believe it's more of a positive reinforcement methods will be traditionally following. Now, coming back to ecotourism, you mentioned about ecotourism activity which is generating income. Elephants, as we all know, it's very expensive to maintain. And unless until you are in a state called Kerala, where there is a lot of money involved in owning an elephant, because it can per day rentals can go as high as 100,000 to 500,000 for the best elephant. So elephant needs to generate income either through logging or through tourism. But do you think this ecotourism in those villages is able to sustain this large number of elephants? As I understand, and I noted down that you mentioned some 60 to 70 elephants in one village itself. So what do you think? Can you give some insights on the revenue generation for sustaining such large number of elephants in a small village?
Yeah, so with that,
Sorry.
I think that's one of the big issues that we see is that even in these, I mean, elephants in general maintain a huge amount of money for this village, but it's not, even for this village, they, as I mentioned, they do have a large forested area. It's difficult to maintain all of those individuals in this forested environment. And there's still not, even in this region, not enough forested area to maintain them. So when you have that full population of elephants back in the forest, you actually have to go collect and provide alternative forage for them, because there's just not enough space for them to move around. There might be potentially enough forage in different regions, but because you have to spread out this large population of elephants in this area, and this forest is still kind of fragmented in different spots or close to other villages, that it's still not quite easy to share or to maintain this population in that region. So I think you do have to kind of develop these alternative livelihoods that are bringing in money from different revenues in order to maintain elephants in these villages. It can't be solely based off of this elephant ecotourism and or just the elephants on their own. And one of the potentials that we saw as well is that in this village in Thailand, there was in general a shift to in general, there's a shift to having more corn or growing more corn. So typically the village grows rice traditionally in paddy fields, and it's kind of rotated crops over different areas in different fields, and it's kind of more naturally maintained. But over time, there's been a shift to gain more money for the village to corn, which isn't quite rotated as much. But in general, it doesn't have too many benefits other than the monetary benefits because the village itself doesn't use any of the corn. So one of the considerations that we were thinking about that could be a possibility is to shift to kind of reforestation. And I think that's essential for places like Thailand. And if you shift to reforestation, you could shift to something that is more economically viable as well. So shifting towards coffee, which is somewhat of what the village is doing as well. So coffee can be grown under shade. So you can have shade grown coffee, which would also maintain a larger forested area as well. And it can also maintain the elephants as well. So kind of this dual purpose for environments and reforestation would probably also be essential for any of these regions.
So with that, let's move to Myanmar, where you mentioned where tourism related to connected with elephants, it's very less. And as you mentioned, it's more of a logging there is happening. So I tend to believe that tourism is a lesser evil. Putting a captive elephant in a tourist destination for tourist rides is a lesser evil than logging, because logging involves more of hard work, and the elephants are put to task which they are not naturally inclined to that level. Do you think this Myanmar as a location will also evolve like a touristy spot like Thailand, where a large number of elephants are employed there?
Yeah, I think that's in general, that's what they would like to do. I think there was this general shift or idea that we could shift from logging, which did bring in some money, but it tends not to be as well spread out, to tourism, which as a whole for the country would create a bigger industry and kind of diverse economy for the country. And I think that's in general what a lot of people were excited about, is kind of developing this kind of ecotourism basis and hub where, in general, Myanmar really wanted to, or probably still does, want to expand its tourism venue to bring money into the country and just to engage more with the other countries in the region and bring people into the country. I think Thailand is an example, like elephant tourism is such a big industry there. There's no reason that couldn't work in Myanmar. And I think having this kind of space would create benefits. I agree. I think the logging it's not a good solution because it is quite stressful for the elephants, and it has to be really highly maintained even to have kind of any of that any kind of that ethical nature. And I think the variation that you'll see with these elephants in Myanmar that's different from the elephants that we see in Thailand is that they do kind of have this more wild, possibly more independent nature than you would see in Thailand. And they definitely do live in a wild environment. So they have kind of, they've been living and foraging in the wild pretty independently on their own for a long period of time, and therefore possibly could maintain it. This kind of wild environment, so creating kind of a wild ecotourism basis or a place for elephants to live in the wild would be better. Yeah, and I saw one of the comments as well one of the big differences between Myanmar and Thailand that's quite different is a large portion of the elephants are governmentally owned in Myanmar, which does potentially allow for kind of a more regulated shift, whereas Thailand, it would have to be independent individual groups of people that would create reserves or places for elephants to live. Whereas with the government, because there's a large population of governmentally owned elephants, the government itself could create a national reserve or preserve for these elephants. And then they also have their elephants that they already own that could populate that region.
And you mentioned about ethical tourism. I tend to believe ethical tourism drive has to start from the origin countries where these tourists are coming to Thailand from. Maybe a lot of campaign needs to be done in the US, the UK, and rest of Europe, where most of these tourists come, and also India. Indians are also it's a big number. Indians, Chinese are also a big number in Thailand. So who flock to this elephant sanctuaries, and elephant sanctuaries are fine, but these touristy locations where they make the elephants to do all sorts of tricks like the circus and play football and whatever. A lot of cruelty goes behind all this, which many people are ignorant. I tend to believe that a large number of NGOs has to work closely with the tour operators in these countries where the tourists come from, and educate the tour operators who are bringing out, who are sending outbound tourists to Thailand to avoid these places. And we should have some level of certification where I understand few of them have, and the certificate should be displayed so that people are aware that the places where the tourist guides are taking them, they follow an ethical practice there. Do you think that is a doable proposition?
Yeah, I think it's definitely possible. I think that's some of the work that we worked on when I worked in Thailand, because we did work with a lot of foreigners as well. And I think one of the big proponents as well is that, I think that is what's happened in Thailand. I think there has been a huge shift to from foreigners to drive what basically makes money in the country, and that over time people have desired a more ethical treatment of elephants and more ethical means. I think it's a difficult thing because there's a lot of ways to hide what's ethical and what's not ethical, and I think understanding what things are ethical, what things aren't ethical, what kind of contact is ethical, what's feasible is quite challenging, especially for people that are just coming into the country and that are bombarded by different things. So I think having a good venue or good online presence for what things, like a guide or a list that's kind of well regulated, and also well regulated in the sense that, like, it's driven all the way down to the mahout level. I think that's one of the big differences that at least I've personally seen, is that when we're talking about ethical elephant tourism, you should really be talking to the mahouts to see how they feel like the elephants are treated, because they're the ones taking care of them, and that often you kind of get a cursory look of how ethical a place is from an outsider perspective, or somebody that's not spent that much time with the elephants. And I find that some places that are less ethical, or that seem less ethical when you first see them, are actually more ethical than they first appear, because they've actually got a much better method of treatment, and maybe just better mahouts in general too, or they're less stressed out, or higher pay. There's a huge amount of things that go into this ethical elephant tourism. It's not just it is partially awareness, but then it's also like the ability to provide for mahouts, and to have mahouts kind of take a stakehold in their elephants as well.
Last point is on the mitigation, the conflict mitigation. Many a times people say that elephants are coming out of forest because there's no fodder inside, there's no water inside, the forest department is not taking care of the elements, and they are left to wander in the villages. As I've seen it in the landscape of Banarata, where I've been working in the last 15 years, seeing it in close proximity, which you are also very familiar landscape, we have noticed that less than 10% of Banarata's elephants comes out to raid crops, and good majority of them are habitual offenders. And this part of the story is not known to the public. As you have rightly said in your presentation, the nutrition value, I would say that the tastiness value in the farmer's crop is far more tempting than anything else for them inside the forest. So for elephants coming out and raiding crops needs to be separated with the regular movement of elephants, which is crossing through the farmer's land or to human habitation because of encroachment or due to other reasons where their paths are blocked. But foraging elephants or habitual crop raiders are the notorious ones who gets captured also, but the public at large is unaware of this pattern. Do you think that in Thailand also the same issue happens when it comes to conflict? The public tend to believe that the forest rangers are not taking good care of their wildlife and not enough protection. That is the reason from the reserves these wild animals are coming. Is the approach the same or different?
I would say it's more or less the same. I would say the level is different and it's more localized, I think, because you don't have quite as a large wild population, and it's kind of distributed differently. I think it is very similar where you've got this kind of idea that like the government and the forest department could be doing more to fix this problem, and that I think farmers and public are often felt like they're left on their own to deal with things in their own way without support. And I think that's pretty common in any of these regions that's one of the challenges.
So the story is the same across the world.
Yeah, I would say the one difference that I saw, and this is just mostly my experience, it might not be the same for everywhere, was Myanmar actually was a little bit different in the level of conflict or the type of conflict I saw. So you do have this kind of crop raiding that I mentioned, especially as well with these captive elephants. But because these elephants are governmentally owned, the farmers actually get compensation for their crops. So I think the Mahout pays for a third, the government pays for a third, and then there's another third paid by somebody else, or the farmer pays for a third. So with that, it does seem to cause a little bit less animosity. I don't know if that was just the specific groups of people that I saw and talked to, that they definitely don't like elephants coming in and eating their food, but I think you don't get the same kind of rage and violence that you do in other regions, especially in certain regions in India. You get that definitely kind of habitual crop raiders cause they keep coming all the time. I think with this like compensation, that does provide some sort of relief there. And also you don't, at least in the locations that I was in, I didn't see the same kind of large barriers and mitigation methods that we see in India and Thailand.
Interesting. I think Rahul, and that sums up our discussions. Over to you.
Okay, sir. Thank you for the wonderful discussions. And the aspect of elephants, different reasons to conflict, and their temptations toward different crops. This can be really interesting because in different landscapes, different crops are grown. So this was really interesting. And moving forward, There is some glitch. Just a minute, sorry. Yes. So moving forward, we have a question and answer session, which will be moderated by Anikethan Hathwar. Uh, Anikethan Hathwar has completed his bachelor's degree and is currently pursuing master's in conservation practice at ITRI Bangalore. He has associated himself as an intern and volunteer in various assignments such as plantation campaigns, urban wildlife rescue under SWAT, and volunteer in barrier assessment project in Kaveri Wildlife Sanctuary, Hills Wildlife Sanctuary, BRT Tiger Reserve, Bannerghatta National Park. He worked as a researcher and intern for the Citizen Science Research and Education Program of Asia Nature Conservation Foundation. Okay. Over to you, Aniket.
Thank you, Rahul, for the introduction. And I would just like to say, Satish and Matthew, the conversation in between you two, it reflected the amount of joint experience you both have on the matters of conflict and elephants. So, and also, Satish's talk was really interesting to see how elephants and conflict have a slight similarity across all the landscape. So I think it was so thorough that we haven't had a lot of questions. But Chaitanya Sridhar, they asked, could you speak a little bit about balancing Mahout upliftment and instilling empathetic methods, especially in the Indian captive scenario, which is much needed? So I think, Satish, could you take a go at that?
Yeah, I think that's really important. And I think one of the things that I saw, I guess in all the regions, it kind of, I would see it in Myanmar a little bit more recently. There's kind of been a shift where there's a lot more mahout turnover, where mahouts would switch moving between different elephants. But definitely in India as well, where you've got mahouts that are coming in for a short period of time just to work for a few months and then leave, that they really don't get an understanding of like how to work with elephants or an appreciation for kind of working with elephants. I guess it's more of monetary gain for a short period of time. I think one of the things is that like there needs to be a genuine push from the ground up where we're giving mahouts an avenue for taking a stakehold in the elephants. So that's one of the big things that we saw in Thailand, was that this was kind of a grassroots level where, you know, when these elephants are in the city, in this tourism environment in the city in Thailand, they're renting out their elephants to the city. The mahouts might go with them, but they don't have as much influence or control over how their elephants are treated or what kind of conditions they're in. And we see this as well in India, where, you know, when you've got this kind of separation between mahouts and owners and what kind of area these elephants are in, that often we see changes in conditions. So I think, you know, having mahouts and owners, one maybe being the same person, and also having a stakehold in how their elephants are treated. So one is kind of this longer term relationship that's developed. It doesn't have to be over a lifetime, but it can be, you know, for 10 years or so, kind of this idea that you've got some sort of relationship or investment in the individual. And then also this idea that, you know, you have some ownership over the individual, where most mahouts want their elephants to be healthy because that's their primary source of income. And when it's their primary source of income, that's also something that they're going to invest in, making sure they have the best quality foods, the best quality environment for them to live in, and the ability to kind of diversify and create the best conditions for themselves is something that there should be an ability for. So I think that's definitely essential, is kind of one is like also just in general more money. So increasing the wages of mahouts would be really essential, and then also increasing the stakeholder, I would say, is essential that mahouts have.
I think Chaitanya, this clears up your question. And I would like to ask the participants, if any of you have any questions, please drop them. And until then, I'm going to be a little bit greedy. I have a few questions. I hope it's okay. I think I have one question regarding invasive species. I think Mathew can also would have also noticed this in Bannerghatta. Many people, many of the farmers, they say that invasive plants like Lantana camara and Senna spectabilis have. They say that those invasives are causing the elephants to come out of the forest because they believe that because of those plants, there is not enough fodder for the elephants inside the forest. Have you observed the same, thinking in Myanmar and Thailand, and is there any other invasive plant which is there and is something similar to this there?
Was that for me or for Mathew? Sorry.
It's for you, Satish.
Oh, okay, yeah. Yeah, I think. Where were you asking about? Sorry.
Both of the landscapes you had mentioned in Myanmar and Thailand.
Yeah. It's definitely an issue in, I think, both landscapes. I think Myanmar, I don't think I have enough knowledge of the entire region to say that that's a major factor there, but I think it definitely is. I think you may have less invasive species, but I can't guarantee that either. I think it depends on what region you're in, but I think it is definitely a factor. And then I think also in Thailand, that's definitely a factor as well. Because the national parks are pretty well managed, actually, it's probably less of a problem in Thailand because they do a good job of maintaining some of these invasive species. But I think just the amount of space that there is still an issue as well.
Okay, thank you. I have one more question. Regarding the economy of the people, you had mentioned that village in Thailand, Hue Pakut, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it correct.
Yep.
Because in today's times, so much of the economy is changing, and people in India, at least, people who've been having captive elephants, are not being able to support their livelihood through the income generated there. So I want to know if that's the same situation in Thailand also, and is there any policy which is affecting this?
I'm not too sure about policies, but I think it's definitely true. I think it's hard to maintain that lifestyle. I think what makes it more sustainable is actually having this kind of ecotourism model in the village, because they're living at home. They don't have to pay for housing and stuff like that in the same way that they would in the city. Food is mostly they're mostly self-sufficient in some senses, where they grow their own food, and but it is kind of this more traditional lifestyle, but it is still difficult to maintain it just based off of the elephants alone. So you still do need to have this alternative incomes. And I think the only way that a large group of elephants would be able to maintain themselves in the village would be to have a good flow of or a good basis for like these alternative livelihoods. So like, as I said, like growing coffee could be something that increases money in the village, and then also because you don't want an influx of tourists either where it's just overrun. So having kind of this balance between maintaining a traditional livelihood and then also becoming too commercial is a difficult balance. I think they do a good job about it there, but I think it's a challenging thing, and it does change the community as well. So it's definitely something that you have to balance between profits and maintaining traditional values.
Right. I have one last pesky question. I wanted to ask you about the mitigation methods used in Thailand and Myanmar, because in India, at least, we have these, as you told, they are negatively reinforcing the animal, like EPTs. It can be EPTs or solar fences or hanging fences. Are there any innovative mitigation methods that they use in Myanmar and Thailand which are different, or something like that?
Yeah, I would say they're very similar. As I said, in Myanmar, I didn't see an extensive amount of mitigation methods implemented. That could just be the low wild population and maybe somewhat less conflict. But yeah, I didn't see a huge amount of mitigation methods implemented. I'm sure they're around, but I couldn't state specifically like the difference. Thailand, I would say they're very similar mitigation methods to India, and they've ranged depending on where they are. I think a lot of what they work on in Thailand is kind of trying to keep elephants, because they do have that smaller population, that they try and keep the elephants in those areas. So a lot of these forested areas are larger forested areas, at least the ones that maintain elephants are larger forested areas, but they're spread out. So there's not a lot of connectivity between them. Kind of maintaining those elephants in that region where they are is probably one of the main things. So it's very similar, I would say.
Okay. Satish, I would like to thank you for sharing this knowledge with us. These are new perspectives because we normally don't give attention to the other than the Indian subcontinent. Normally, we don't give much head. So thank you so much for sharing your knowledge. And I would like to ask Mathew if you have anything to add, or if you have any questions. And also Rahul also, if you have any questions, you can go ahead and ask them.
No, as of now, I don't have any questions.
Okay, Rahul, over to you then. And one last thing, I would like to apologize to Mathew and Satish and the participants for those pesky disturbances in the middle. I don't know how they get into these meetings, but sorry, please.
Yeah,
I apologize for that.
maybe via the Facebook link. Even I don't know.
Yeah. Over to you, Rahul.
Yeah. So Satish sir and Mathew sir, it was a really great talk and a conversation. Thank you.
Yep.
Are
Thank you.
there
It's great
any
talking
other
with you.
questions left?
With regard to invasive species, I just want to add one point. Due to this rampant wildlife conflict in Wayanad Wildlife Sanctuary, the government of Kerala has earmarked 30 crores to remove this invasive species like lantana. Now, which is now there's a shift in the prey population, and the predators are also following the prey, and they eventually come out of the villages. So let us see how this large-scale removal of lantana will result in less conflict. I mean, this is something which has been done extensively in Bandipur and all over a period of time, but somehow the invasive species come back with double the vigor. So hopefully, once for all, we will have a solution to this.
Sir, even in
and
okay.
Satish, you want to say?
please, Rahul, please.
Even in Amrabad Tiger Reserve, one of my classmates worked there for his thesis. there also they have started to remove lantana in patches of the forest, and they are getting good results. I think they're removing it, the lantana, for 3 generations or 5 generations, but they are seeing good results, he was telling.
Yeah, I think also one of the things that we have to remember, at least in my opinion, of removing lantana and all these invasives, that it's not just restricted just to removal. It should also include the idea of reforestation, because in areas that are heavily affected by lantana, you're not going to have that reintroduction of native species that are going to create like this basis for lantana not to take hold again in the future. So I think you have to kind of combine both of them and not just think of it as only removal. It's kind of revitalization for the region.
Yeah, I think my organization A-Tree has been doing a lot of work in Hills, Malemadeshwara Hills. There they have actively for 10 years now, they've been using the lantana to make furniture. But one interesting thing they have noticed is that where the lantana has been cleared, senna is taking over. And senna is a very different than lantana because it's a tree species, and it's a new problem in that landscape now. And also there has been a mass senescence of bamboo there. So it was the same event that had caused lantana to take over last time. So yeah, there are a lot of problems now because of that. And also, like Mathew sir told about the Wayanad part, let us see what will happen in the future. Over to you, Rahul.
Okay. So thank you, Satish sir, for the amazing talk, and Mathew sir and Satish sir for the conversation we had. And thank you, Anikethan, for moderating the question and answer sessions. I think we'll end the meeting now. Thank you, everyone.
Everybody.
Thanks for giving us an opportunity. Thank you very much. See, you may not be aware, Satish and me were part of the first brainstorming session in 2014, the start of Friends of Elephant, much before it came into existence. The thought process, I still have the photograph of Satish. It took some time for me to recognize him. He has changed a lot. I mean, all of us have changed. So he's been a part of Friends of Elephants as old as me, much before it came to inception. So it was nice to reconnect with you.
We should be thanking you for creating this platform.
No, it is Varmaji's.
Yeah.
It's Varmaji's platform. It is his brainchild. Few of us I still remember there was a medical doctor, there was conservationist, there was a businessman. He brought in his people known to him, his friends from varying walks of life to Kaban Park with this idea. And he's been consistent at it. And he pulls all of us into it. And we got all hooked onto it. So it was interesting to meet some new faces in Friends of Elephants, young blood, to carry on with the baton as it goes further.
Hopefully we can do those offline events again, sir, and we can all meet once.
Yes.
So the metro events were always good. It was good interaction also.
Yes, conversations would be much more fun in offline.
Okay. So thank you very much. So nice of you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks. Good night. I think this recorded version, then if you can share a recorded version with all of us, it'll be great.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you. It will be uploaded on Facebook and YouTube.
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone.